Welcome back to Son of Chelsea. Daniel Childs here. Hope you all had a brilliant weekend. So today's show is mainly going to be looking at some of the big conundrums facing Chelsea across this summer transfer window. Not just in terms of the transfer window, but also a little bit for Enzo Maresca, looking at the new season, how Chelsea are going to look heading into the new season. So we've got quite a bit to get through in terms of left wing, Christopher Nkunku, Nicolas Jackson, Noni Madueke, and ending on some goalkeeper chat that's had over the weekend. So we're going to jump into all of that. Please do give me your thoughts, your feelings, your perspectives in the comments below about Chelsea. Tomorrow we'll be previewing Chelsea's final group game, whether they can qualify for the last 16 of the Club World Cup. So we'll be jumping into that from tomorrow. But I think the best place to start is around the winger chase regarding Chelsea this summer. It's a complex issue. It's one that I've given my thoughts on, I've written about as well. So please go and check those videos, podcasts and articles out if you haven't already. So the new name that's come up is Bradley Barcola from PSG. A big name, I think a name that would definitely excite people if Chelsea were to somehow get a deal over the line for him. This is nothing concrete or kind of serious. It's just a report from L'Equipe that suggested that PSG have turned down approaches from both Chelsea and Arsenal because the player himself is kind of not in the position he was at the start of the year under Luis Enrique because of the signing of Kvaratskhelia from Napoli, who obviously became such a big part of PSG's 11 as they went all the way to win the Champions League. But in the case of Bradley Barcola, obviously a very exciting young winger. If you look at his numbers, specifically league numbers, over 10 goals, I think it's 13 or 14 league goals, in terms of a really exciting, invigorating kind of really at times dominant PSG side that has a lot of youth about it. And I know a lot of people have kind of, and even internally at Chelsea, have cited PSG as an example for why Chelsea's young policy in terms of squad building may come to fruition in a big way. But in terms of that left wing position, PSG apparently don't want to sell, or at least that's their position at the moment. And from what we understand, the Standard have reported this, others have reported this, that still Jamie Gittens remains the top priority for Chelsea. Despite interest from Bayern Munich, this has come up over the weekend that Bayern are now interested in signing Gittens as well. I still sit here with the belief, I think, no matter my opinions on it, I still think it is most likely, just based on the evidence that's been in front of me in terms of Chelsea's transfer business, in terms of what they've done. And you always, when you look at transfers, most of the time, but I think more so because we know so much of the inner workings, because Chelsea are quite public in a lot of ways in terms of the stories regarding transfers come out so regularly. Gittens, as the Liam Delap did, that's why I predicted at the start of 2025 that Liam Delap would become a Chelsea player. And I was pretty confident that would happen for several reasons. And they're kind of key ones that are persistent throughout this ownership so far, or at least since the sporting director and that regime came in. Looking at the age, he's 20 years old, Jamie Gittens, so there's going to be major resale value in the future if Chelsea do sell him. Potential for growth, of course, is huge there as well if he continues to develop at Chelsea. I think as well the price maybe not being the most ridiculous in terms of wages as well, which comes into whether a deal gets over the line or not, more so maybe than even the fee, which is kind of the headline thing. But wages, of course, we know a big part of Chelsea's structure at the moment. They don't want to break that wage structure. And then obviously some form of a link to Man City. It sounds lazy, it sounds simplistic, but really if you look at Chelsea's transfer business, it's hard not to see that and not to make that link. Even, you know, Gittens, Delap, we've heard reports of Chelsea being interested with James Trafford, the goalkeeper from Burnley, who I know Newcastle are after as well. There is that consistent link, and it's one that I think usually makes me think, like, tip the scales of whether I think this still actually is feasible rather than just like talking about a player. That's why I still think Gittens is one I could see getting over the line this summer. I will consistently state this, that I don't think Gittens would be a terrible signing. Looking at some of the numbers, looking at him as a player, looking at what he's produced, he has played to a high level. I think the big question mark over Jamie Gittens, and to be fair, we can say this about any transfer, it's whether the style and the approach that, you know, is there for Borussia Dortmund in the Bundesliga, especially that league, which at times is a very specific league. It's very different to the Premier League in certain aspects. Whether he can translate what he's done at Borussia Dortmund into a Chelsea team that needs an improvement in the left wing. If you just look plainly at the numbers and compare them with Jadon Sancho, who probably played the most in left wing for Chelsea last season, there is an improvement there. So that obviously, from just like a tick box exercise, you'd think, yeah, that's an improvement. In terms of an upwards of like, I don't know, 5 to 10 goals, that's obviously a huge thing. And I think what will frustrate people across the course of this summer is if they look at the signings on deadline day in September and they look across them and they think, are there any needle movers there? At least from the outset. Some players can obviously surprise us and at the start may look like kind of mediocre to kind of placeholder signings, maybe future signings, and they burst out of the traps and completely change the perception of them. Cole Palmer is obviously the biggest one I've seen in recent times, one of the most shocking. However, I look at the signings, I look at the targets we're going for, and I could just see this still happening. Probably post World Cup, Club World Cup at this point. Whether Chelsea and Dortmund both get knocked out at a similar time, I can just see this one going on. And whether you are as negative as some other people, because some people may be really open to it. Do you think Jamie Gittens would improve on the options from last season? That I think is the big question for any move this summer. Let me know in the comments below. Christopher Nkunku, apparently his reps, this is also from L'Equipe, are in conversation with Manchester United over a possible deal. Man United moving quickly. I do ponder whether Nkunku go into United, because I think there have been links between Nkunku and United before, but Brian Mbeumo is maybe getting his head turned to go to Spurs to reunite instantly with Thomas Frank. We've seen them sign Matthias Cunha, kind of looking at these inside or at least maybe second striker options that Ruben Amorim clearly wants. So in terms of what Man United, I guess from a profile point of view, are going for this summer to maybe work around a centre forward, I do think that Nkunku would definitely fit that mould and maybe would get a role at Old Trafford that he simply isn't getting and probably is not going to get at Stamford Bridge. That's for certain. There is always going to be trepidation selling to a Premier League rival, especially a historic Premier League rival and a big team like Man United. That's undeniable. Like Man United have obviously, they're in a terrible place at the moment. But even in Chelsea history, we've seen a position where you have one terrible season, but then you're back up there challenging for European places. Because Man United are still able to pull off deals because they are one of the biggest clubs in the world, definitely the biggest club in England. And I think that is something that I could see this still very much picking up pace. Because I don't see where the future is for Nkunku. I was shocked that he came off the bench against LAFC. I mean, I really was stunned, just given the narrative and kind of the conversation around him. But I don't think many people are going to lose much sleep around losing him. Again, you'd hope Chelsea are able to attain a sizable fee from one of their rivals if that was to happen. Because, Kai Havertz going to Arsenal, you gain 65 million. That's I think, a good fee for him. Mason Mount, wasn't it, similar, wasn't it? But upwards of 60 million. You want to attract at least a decent fee back to get some justification. It's okay to sell that player. But there will be fear if he goes to Man United. But I can't see Christopher, just like I could see Jamie Gittens arriving at Chelsea, I can't see a situation where Nkunku's still at Chelsea past the deadline. It's whether he stays in England or goes back to the Bundesliga, which I always felt was probably the most sensible move for him for his career, but maybe not. I want to talk about a couple of players here. Noni Madueke and Nicolas Jackson, two players who have been linked away in recent days from Chelsea. Madueke more consistently, but obviously after what Jackson did on Friday in Philly, many people have kind of thrown their hands up or kind of just said they're done with him. I kind of would just, rather than talking about specific links, because we don't really have them, but there's been rumours and just kind of a general conversation about whether you'd be okay with these two players leaving. I disagree with selling either of these players. I think both, my justification for not selling these players and for sticking with them is the same on both fronts. Are you actually able to replace them with superior players? Jackson, in his 2 seasons at Chelsea, is averaging, his kind of base level is around 10 Premier League goals at least. If you're not replacing that with another 10 Premier League goals from someone else, then you got real problems, along with the other things I think tangibly he brings to Chelsea. Noni Madueke, I think, is the same. Best winger from last season, best performing winger from last season, despite the obvious frustrations people have with him, which I understand, but he showed a tendency that he could even play on the left when required and put in a pretty decent outing as well. If you're not replacing him, and with the fact that he'd probably go to, I think, a Newcastle or an Aston Villa, a team that has been competing in similar areas to Chelsea, especially over the last season, which we hope to be beyond. But at the moment, you still think like Chelsea in their current place are probably going to be competing for a top 6 spot. So you've got to factor that. Replacing goals with superior names has to be the aim if you're selling those players. And I just don't have much faith and confidence that selling them is not going to come back to bite us, or at the very least is going to restrict Enzo Maresca's options heading into the new season. I'd much rather be in a position. This is not a great situation, but I'd rather walk into the. If you're telling me right now, you either sell Noni and Jackson without adequate replacements, or you just keep them. I don't know how anyone would not take the second option there of just keeping them, because I think their end product has at least justified they can be decent to, at times, quite impactful players for Chelsea. And my argument always is, if you're letting those goals go out the door, you simply have to replace them. If you're not replacing them, you're putting yourself in a very precarious situation. And that's why I think on both fronts, unless you're bringing in someone who's going to up the, out wide, whether left wing, right wing, is going to up those goals by a significant amount. Or in the case of Jackson and Delap, you'd hope at the very least from a base level, there's an improvement there, because you're hopefully adding more goals that weren't there along with Jackson last season. So that's my position. You can have the frustration with those two players. And if there's a guarantee that you are replacing both of them, in the case of Jackson, I think maybe more so in Convert at the moment, with someone better, fine. But if you're not, and I think, again, we have to look at what is realistically going to happen in the current market. And when you factor in what Jackson has produced as a young striker, which isn't terrible, if you're not replacing him with someone significantly better, I mean someone who's going to walk in and completely eclipse what he has done, that's my frustration. That would be my big fear, is that we're not, and you're weakening when you don't really need to. I think both of those players, I think Chelsea are a stronger squad keeping both of those players and then adding on top of them. So I think that's my position at the moment. Let's talk about goalkeepers before we wrap up. Mike Maignan, there was messaging over the weekend, the hokey cokey of whether we're in for him, we're not in for him. And then I found the I think it was Cave Solikov from Sky reporting that, it sounds like a really crappy ITV game show, like the ad for this, that Chelsea's goalkeeping situation this summer, one's going to get sold, one's going to get loaned, one's going to remain. It sounds like the ad for not even ITV1, probably ITV2 or 3 game show over the summer. I don't know if any of you would watch that. So we know that there's a bit of mess going around with the goalkeepers. Petrovic, it feels like, has been frozen out. Mike Penders, I'm a firm believer, if he ain't number one, shouldn't be sticking around. At his age, he has to be playing consistent first team football. His career potentially completely stalls, or his development stalls, if he remains at Chelsea and he isn't number one. And of course, the Maignan approach that clearly happened. And now we've got a report from the Times that, as we've heard before, West Ham are interested in Robert Sanchez. Probably most clearly, obviously, being driven by one Graham Potter, who worked with Sanchez at Brighton. So there's that to factor in as well. I'm still of the firm belief, especially heightened by the fact of Petrovic clearly being frozen out and either being loaned or sold. You go in for Mike Maignan and you get that deal over the line. I think if Robert Sanchez leaves Chelsea, and Chelsea, either you're then really promoting Penders instantly and you're saying you are the number one. There's another goalkeeper out there, which I hope isn't James Trafford. I want to make that abundantly clear. I'm not saying Trafford is a horrendous goalkeeper. I'm not. But again, we're talking about levels when you've just got Champions League money and you've got Mike Maignan, France number one, AC Milan number one and captain. I'm not going to sit here and confidently say I think that deal gets done. But I just kind of logically think, why aren't you going back in for that deal? It feels like a bit of an ego thing. Maybe it feels like a thing you don't want to be beaten in the market, or you don't want to come out looking silly. For me, you look more silly not getting that deal over the line than pulling out. Unless you are buying again, unless you've got someone else lined up who is going to be significantly better than Mike Maignan, which I don't think you do in the current market. So I would like Chelsea to go back in there and get that done. I'd ask you guys right now, if let's paint up a scenario, Sanchez is sold to West Ham. What then happens with Petrovic? Is Petrovic still an outcast? Because as much as it seems certain at the moment, we know how quickly things can flip in the world of Chelsea currently. With Trevor Chalobah had no way back apparently last summer. He had a way back. So maybe it's not completely done entirely for Georgia Petrovic, because then there becomes a conversation. Well, Georgia Petrovic had a really good season. He wants to be number one, understandably, or a chance to be number one somewhere. Maybe that happens. You still going for Maignan? I would still go for Maignan because I think the opportunity is there, and I think it's a bit of a waste to not do it. And I also think you want that position clarified before the start of the season. It's such a big position. It's such a crucial position. It's been unstable for a while. I'd like to have a secure number one. And when Maignan has turned up, the opportunity's presented itself, I don't know why we can't go back in for him. And I do wonder, as Simon Phillips has pointed out, it's all a bit of gamesmanship, mind games from Chelsea. They clearly want a new goalkeeper. They've been signalling it. I just hope it isn't a diversion tactic where they go in for a more serious and an elite caliber Maignan at the start of the window, can't get him, and then we pivot to Trafford, who has a Man City connection. I'm praying Newcastle, as reported at the moment, are going to get that deal done, so then that alternative isn't there anymore, and we just get serious and get Mike Maignan. I just want to wrap up the show by talking about this tweet. Because as usual, there's like a backlash to the backlash a lot of the time, right? Where we talk about overreaction, hyperbole, people being too negative after one result. I sat here on Friday, despite my criticisms about, I thought Maresca's experimenting was not great. I thought not playing Santos is really puzzling. There were some bad performances, but I wasn't going to sit here and say it's the end of the world. However, as you know, I'm going to be critical when I think Chelsea haven't played well, and I don't think anyone can watch that game on Friday and tell me Chelsea played well. They got outplayed. I thought they had some, individually, there were some really poor performances. But, you know, the reaction to it has maybe made it seem like a bigger deal than it actually is, or a worse deal than it actually is. And I think Archie L19 at Archie Standing, I'm sure many of you follow him. If you don't, definitely go and suggest. I think he has some really good thoughts on Chelsea. And he points out 10 reasons why maybe things feel worse than they are, or more frustrated, and kind of the negativity feels like it's burst up again. And he says, I would imagine the reason most people are furious, it's necessarily because of just a result and performance. It was a terrible day at the office, that can happen. It's because the same issues we have had for a while aren't being addressed. Number one, Robert Sanchez is still on number one. Number two, lack of Santos minutes. Jackson still has nothing between his ears. Gusto is still awful at defending. James still being played in a silly position. Palmer exhausted and he still needs a rest, but no adequate replacement. Same as Cucurella. Neto and Noni are backup level wingers. Lack of leadership in the group when adversity arises, and a hectic transfer window, media briefs, and missing out on supposed key targets just leads to more questions. You know, I agree with most of that there. I think 1 to 9 obviously being on pitch issues, and I think it's distinguishing, between like what matters, kind of what's overblown, what's hyperbole, and then what is, I think, genuine criticism, which is clearly there to be had on you know, the performance on Friday. And I also just think in terms of what we're seeing so far in this transfer window. I keep on saying this, like it's the 23rd of June when I'm recording this. You cannot define this window on the 23rd of June. However, I think it is also fair to point out that what we've seen so far, and again, we can only judge by what we've seen. I can't judge what I haven't seen yet. I can't sit here and completely... There's no point having a show if I sit here and tell you I'm not going to give you an opinion on anything until some date later down the line. Yes, I will give a conclusion and a verdict and the ability and gift of hindsight to be able to look back at the whole window and in totality give you a verdict, positive or negative, on it. But, you know, we can only live by what we've seen so far. And what we've seen so far is the failure to secure Mike Maignan, which I think would have been a really, really positive move. I think it really would have lifted everyone, and the excitement of watching him in the Club World Cup as our number one and really securing that position down. And I also think it would have been given a lot of credit, rightly, as I would have, to the sporting directors to prove that they could get that caliber, that type of deal over the line. They can still do it between now and the end of the window. I think the rest of it, I'm not sitting here and telling you it's simple. It's not FIFA. This is not, you know, as easy as, you know, tapping a few buttons and you get the perfect player. Of course not. I think the concern I have, and is probably the conversation and maybe doubts they're having internally in the club, is that there are no kind of real obvious options, or at least ones that don't come with some risk, right? You can buy Jamie Gittens and there is some room and some ability to feel he could be a good fit and he could improve our options, at least in the short term. In the long term, he can maybe become a superior player, like a really, really good left winger that completely excels and thrives and develops at Chelsea. Clearly a player that wants to move. However, I think what people would like to see this summer, because there's been so much potential bought, is the time for buying potential with all the money that's been spent is kind of, the patience for that has kind of run out. And I think what people would like to see after what was a positive end to the season is that team, Maresca, be given the tools to go again to another level. And it also doesn't help whether you think this is fair or not, but I just think this is the reality. And it also, I do think it matters because we're competing with these clubs in the Premier League directly. It's when you see the moves that Liverpool are making after winning the Premier League title. They are not in any way resting on their laurels. They are not in any way sitting back and just, smelling the roses and thinking how wonderful they are. They have moved quickly and precisely to replace Trent Alexander-Arnold with Jeremy Frimpong, a very, very good player. Another player in Florian Wirtz, who's made the move now. And very likely Milos Kerkez, a left-back who I know Chelsea were linked with during the season. They are not sitting back. In all of those positions, they are looking to upgrade on an already title-winning team. Man City, we've seen the moves they have done. You cannot sit still. Even Man United are looking to make moves to upgrade their first team. At the moment, other than Liam Delap and some of the loanees returning, we don't know how Esteban Willian is going to look in a Chelsea shirt. And I'm still of the belief I'm not putting ridiculous pressure on him. I don't expect him to walk in and become a superstar. If he does, hallelujah, amazing, right? He solves so many problems if he comes in and becomes that. But I'm not going to, throw a tantrum if he doesn't. And I don't think you should either. He's a very young player. And maybe Santos becomes a real big player. And also factoring in, as I said earlier with Jackson and Madueke, you can't define players, especially younger players right now, and say they will never get better. They cannot improve on what they've already done. There is a world when those players reach another level and can go again and become better. But I do think it will be accelerated. It will be helped in the market if Maresca has sufficient left-back depth, if he has a winger that he can rely on to produce and add goals that maybe others can't from previous seasons. And I think the goalkeeping position, especially the leadership I think Maignan could bring, could be invaluable. So those are my thoughts currently. I think it will heat up. I mean, I think if Chelsea go out of the Club World Cup in the next week or two, which is likely going to happen, I mean, I have to say, based on our plot, if we get through on Wednesday, I think it's likely Bayern Munich, who are basically the best team in the competition at the moment, based on what I've seen, one of the best. You can't expect Chelsea to beat Bayern Munich. It'd be great if they do. I think whenever Chelsea's journey in the Club World Cup ends, I think we will see, hopefully, things accelerate once the team are back, or at least, the recruitment team are not out in America. And we'll hopefully see an acceleration in transfers. That's my hope. Those are my thoughts. So please do like, subscribe. As I said earlier, we'll be back again, starting to turn our attention back to the football. I've got a really exciting interview coming up this week on the podcast. Shall I spoil it or not? But I think it is one that's slightly different. It's about a book that's been released, speaking to the author about Chelsea very recently, that I've really enjoyed reading, and I'm sure many of you will enjoy it as well as listening to the author speak about it, because it's big in Chelsea history, in very recent Chelsea history. So a teaser there, that will be coming out later in the week, post the review on Wednesday. So stay tuned for that. Please like, subscribe, check out my Substack. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and I will see you again very, very soon. All the best.